We have got a good 24 minutes for discussion and any questions. So is there anyone who'd like to get us started? Yeah.
I have a very picky, down-in-the-weeds question, so I don't know if it'll get us started, but I want to get it out of the way. As a librarian, I'm suffering from genre confusion of some of the documentation that was referenced today, particularly by Fiona, and what's been mentioned in like yesterday's session that was convenient for us. And so you all are talking about this vision of a landing page and prepared, and you're also talking about this vision of a data paper. And I know that those could just be synonyms for what was talked about yesterday, where we saw models of a data descriptor paper, and we saw that was very intentionally structured so that it was both human and machine usable, and you could make sense of it. So it seems like we're floating, as happens in highly evolutionary periods, a lot of experiments. But is there any hope of mapping some of this language onto each other so that it simplifies some of it? What does a landing page do? Is it doing the same thing as a data descriptor paper that we learned about yesterday? Is there any common ground here? Is it a wild west?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the landing page is basically a summary of all the metadata that surround that particular data set, while the data publication or the data paper goes more into depth about the provenance with much more information that's not necessarily included in the metadata.
Does that seem, Liz, to you like something that maps to the different genres that were looked at yesterday?
Yes, I think it does. So I think what you're referencing, Gail, is the scientific data structure of a paper and also gigascience. And I think they're providing, as Kirsten said, a much longer narrative about the data than you would find necessarily on a landing page that is just there to describe the data, but not necessarily to describe more detail about its generation and acquisition and precise conditions around which all of that occurred.
I think because of the overload on authors, and for those of us that are in author support roles, like us on our campuses, trying to find some common ground or simplicity in this very evolutionary period is really helpful.
It is actually, continuing on a little bit about the perspective of a repository. We get into these situations where, investigators come to us and say, look, I have this data set, I want to publish it at the EarthChem library, but they do have, 3 pages of description how this, and it's especially true for syntheses, where there's a lot of procedural aspects involved. And in that case, we recommend to write a data paper, because the metadata that we have, it has an abstract, but that just describes what's in there, but not necessarily the entire provenance. But I would be happy if we could come up with sort of a common description that, we can hand out to investigators and say, look, this is how these different pieces are defined, and if you do have a lot of information about how you generated this data set, and it's not just a machine and sort of some standard information, then go to a publisher and get it out, and we just link it up with that additional information.
Publishers are forced to be more intentional and also more transparent about these genres, because you're being accepted or rejected around whether you fulfill the requirements. So publishers tend to have to be quite explicit in when you submit what channel it goes in and the criteria for review, so you know whether you can win or not, and you can play to win. But I think with some of these more informal modes of dissemination, if we don't also have good guidelines on what that landing page is, I feel like I'm going to lose my authors. They're just going to go, I'm out of here. This is too complex. You're giving me too many variables in the equation. I don't have time for any of them. It sounds like, the repository wants me to write a paper, and then the publisher wants me to write a different paper. That's too much load on me. So I'm just trying to see it from the confused author's side.
And that's hopefully something that, these different groups that are forming can address, where authors can be involved in the discussion and make that point, that it the landscape is too
I think Peter has something that he wants to add to this.
Say that there's because what we're describing now is not scalable unless you generate it automatically, really. So that means you have to put the burden a little bit up front. You need to structure the elements that go in either of these descriptors appropriately from the start. Take advantage of modern web techniques like content negotiation, so that government organizations now are being required to have landing pages for all their government data with specific conformance to metadata, particular metadata standards. This is an environmental area. And they're all having to do it they have to generate it automatically. And it's through content negotiation, so that they can send the content to a web page, but they can also send it to another repository so that if it needs to show up on their page as well. And this is a question about shifting the burden, right? Changing it from one place to the other. Remove it from the authors of the data, the scientists. They're not going to be able to do this.
Okay. Alice.
I think the opposite end of the spectrum questions about, but probably a bit related, is more of a kind of slight crystal ball question. You mentioned the ST paper, and Mike Stebbins spoke yesterday and last year, and I've heard him speaking to every time he says the same thing, which is we want research for data and we want it now. And he talks about the issues around this in terms of kind of logistics, but realistically, how quickly do you think researchers are actually going to be able to comply with
that? Crystal ball answer or pragmatic answer? The pragmatic answer is that the large agencies which have been requested to respond and address how they're going to do that, most of the agencies have had the submissions. A couple of agencies are still pending and have asked for extra time. But I think they've done a pretty decent job at laying out what that looks like. And it corresponds to typical, not sequester, what's the word, proprietary periods that are commonly in use in the scientific community. And that's usually anywhere between 6 months and 2 years is sort of a standard proprietary period for data that's related to publicly funded research. And it's likely that that will just be more formalized and will be checked in things like reports and so on. It's already checked in the National Science Foundation. And I think there's also a shift going on. There's a shift going on because large organizations that are streaming data and streaming it out onto the internet now really are already releasing their data right away. It's just that it's not very well known, and it's not appreciated actually what proportion of publicly funded data is actually readily available right now. No one's ever gone out and truly documented that. There are many agencies that really don't know what data they have still. All right? So it's actually potentially not quite as bad as we think. But then that is, my comments are directed at the sort of the larger providers. We all know that there is a very significant number of smaller providers right down to the individual level. And my crystal ball says they initially will just be ignored and they will be let off, I think. Because I don't think anyone's going to come to a senior researcher's office and say, I'm not leaving here until you give me your data, right?
Unless it was NSF funded.
Maybe.
I think that then it will happen earlier.
We hope. She's optimistic.
Yeah.
So we've heard about, I would think it's to some extent two different philosophical approaches to the database data repositories. The type that you're talking about, which is sort of a large number of fairly specific ones that are kind of field specific oriented. Then we've also heard yesterday about picture and dryad, they're very big and have lots of different types of data. Extremely easy to use, everybody knows they're there, but there's lots of variability in formats. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think about the pros and cons of those two approaches.
Well,
She's biased.
I'm clearly biased. That was my talk. I think that, again, think back at this three-tier approach that I had in the slides. I think that's the way to do it. really think that these very generic repositories, and Dryad has a focus on the biosciences, so it's not completely generic. But for example, institutional repositories, I come from Columbia, we have the academic commons. People can just put their data in there and say complied with policy. That data, to me, goes into a black hole because nobody can look, no librarian, in my view, has the knowledge in every discipline out there to say, is the data well documented, which normalization corrections in the chemistry lab have been applied, or, what type of information was collected with sensors that, it's simply too daunting. And I think that disciplinary perspective needs to be there to make the data usable. But as I said, that's not scalable, and we need a common infrastructure that does the long-term preservation, the landing pages maybe, and the metadata, bring them into formats that can be easily harvested. But it needs an integration in this ecosystem where, these larger facilities like, Dryad or institutional libraries and so on can provide services working together with the communities. That's my preferred solution, clearly, because I really think that where data management has shown a significant impact on the sciences, it has always been when there was a domain-specific effort behind it. I can give you the Sloan Digital Sky Survey was a big one, the Human Genome Project. It's really, a science question driving the aggregation of the data, building the standards and so on that has that impact on the science. Otherwise, we're just sort of, we're making data accessible. That's...
Yeah, but that's what people think.
why do we do it? It's an audit, that's...
I also, I know that I disagree with your point, but I think also there's the broadest, it needs to be discoverable too, and search tools across the broad range of data have to be very useful for that too. And if you don't even know where it is,
Right. That's absolutely true. And there's also this aspect that, there is quite a number of domains that don't have repositories right now. So, the investigators there are kind of lost, what should I do with my data? And we need to have these solutions right now to at least make sure that the data remains there, that it is at least at the sort of discovery level well documented. But I'm always worried that these sort of easy steps will make people move away from the more involved steps of the domain repositories, that it kind of takes over and everybody says, I'm just going to put it there into, the big bucket, and it becomes useless. That's my fear.
So, Figshare, Flickr, take your pick. Sort of
Well, they're not the same. Come on.
Well, actually, I'd like $1 for every time a high-ranking official said in a meeting, why aren't we just using the public utilities, the commercially supported things?
But there's journals that have made formal agreements with Figshare. Figshare is a DOI issuer. There's more integrity to me and chance of trustedness with a Figshare than there is Flickr that has...
It's owned by Google?
Macmillan Digital Science, so the people that bring you nature. But still, well, we don't know, actually. It's a very good question, what really the business model for Figshare is and how they can do it for free.
It's this question about long-term preservation and capabilities to handle the migration of where the content actually ends up, right?
But I was going to agree with you as somebody who works in a library scholarly communication office and is supposed to be touting the use of our repository, and we're one of the bigger repositories, and our own discussions, to be frank, are about for data research, data management, capturing the very end of that long tail, right? And really trying to understand where we have unique value proposition, which I myself think the ROI isn't even there. So I actually suggest they send to Figshare if they don't have a discipline, because at least they get the DOI, and I have more trustedness there than I do for some other things. So everything you were saying about domain repositories really resonates. But there are certain significant blobs of content and creation of research data, and some of which is federally funded. And, you know, I tend to talk more about graduate scholarship as one of these silos because it's so poorly represented anywhere. No one's advocating for it. But there's an awful lot of graduate scholarship that I'm not sure gets the support and the education, and they don't know necessarily. And this is stuff that is great literature. This is the thesis of the dissertation.
Absolutely.
So it's not hooked to a publication. And that's where our repository may be the only shot. In fact, I get questions from people all around the ETD community that want me to blog about where to put thesis and dissertation data as a reposited resource, because no one wants it to go to ProQuest and put it behind a paywall. Plus, ProQuest isn't able to support the kinds of things you're talking about. So I think there is that blog. That seems to be, unless you guys do a better job with outreach to grad students.
Well, what we're trying to do is outreach to departments, actually. You know, from the perspective of our facility, we've started discussions with Columbia to be sort of take a first step and become an example how, you know, data management best practices could be integrated into, you know, especially graduate studies. That, you know, I think that's the right way to go to do it sort of on a higher level.
And I don't know if you think that societies would have a role, because graduate students, I think what you're saying is what some of us that are in scholarly communication and librarians think, which is that we don't see people going to our repositories, like you said, academic comics, because that's not their birds of a feather. There's no value proposition to a faculty member, and they don't get necessarily any sense of affiliation. You know, they get no thrill of affiliation by knowing their stuff is in the Texas A&M repository. They want to be where their peeps are, you know, where their community of practice is. For all the reasons you mentioned, which is you're just much better equipped to handle and curate and describe because you have the domain knowledge. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer to me.
So I found, I'm going to claim a little bit of moderator privilege and say that one of the points that Peter made that I found most controversial touches on that, and that was the point that when you showed the slide with producer and consumer and the yellow curation box in the middle and said publishers could be the curators. I know that there are people out there who would disagree with that very, very strongly.
So I was hoping for.
And I do wonder whether actually there is a role for societies to play a role in defining those standards, especially around the long tail of data, the orphan data that currently doesn't have defined structure. And so I wondered if you would like to comment on that.
So I think societies do have a role, and they've typically been very hands-off in this particular area. So there's a couple of societies, for example, the International Union of Crystallography has been particularly effective and active in this particular area, setting down norms for their communities that have been in place for a long time. It's about incentive, and it's about the people in the leadership positions in those societies that are really taking on those issues. And the fact that AGU has a data policy at all is largely because of the president at the time was very data savvy and realized that they really needed one. So, yeah, call for, you know, absolutely. I completely agree.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Is everyone stunned into silence? Friday afternoon lag? Any more questions? Because if not, I have one more, and a few people picked this up on Twitter as well, and I think the idea of not alarming reviewers about how to peer review data is a really important point. And then we saw 3 slides of how to peer review data. And I wonder if there is a way of making it onto one slide so that it scares people even less perhaps than that did. And I'm looking at Fiona when I asked that one.
Yes.
So what is it in a nutshell that we should be asking peer reviewers to do with data?
Yeah, it's around, again, the sort of the community standards, the community norms. Does it conform to what the community needs and expects? I think.
And
that's the whole thing, really. And, the whole rest of it, I think, sort of breaks down to that, is there value to having it published? Is it accessible in the format it's in, the right format? Everything else kind of cascades from that, I think.
Yeah, and I actually think when I saw your long list that list could become less daunting for reviewers if you could separate out those steps that actually a repository could take. Looking at the format, sort of the more technical aspects of it, that is something that I think the repository could take on. There are other, aspects of the data that a peer can judge or can give suggestions with that would improve the utility of the data. But, I think it would be nice to kind of categorize the different aspects of the process.
I think, and again, that's part of the accreditation, and it's back to what does a repository do? If they've got a kite mark or whatever, does that mean that there's a certain level of review or QA that you can just take as read because it's in there? And if we know that and everyone understands it, then the whole thing gets a lot simpler.
Good. Peter, you wanted to make a comment on that?
Yeah, so I know I flashed through it fairly quickly, but the particular government agency workflow for data release had exactly this discussion. They were strongly wary of A, introducing a new role, but B, increasing burden on any type of review process. And so this last thing I say, which is disaggregating the functions, is really important. And in addition to into repositories that can play a role, metadata reviewers, there are people who love metadata. They just adore it. It's unbelievable. And they would just be thrilled to do a metadata review, which actually in many ways can account for more than 80, sometimes 90% of the review of the data itself. Right conventions, right structure, all these different things, that's metadata. Let those people do that. Give them reward for it. Let them see lots of metadata reviews across their organization. And then restrict the attention, the shorter list, for where you really need either domain expertise or other forms of expertise. I think so we have to think about those roles and responsibilities.
There was a quick comment back here, and then I think we're done.
Question. So since both the review process for both happen in parallel, you have two different sets of reviewers reviewing both separately. And if that's the case, do they connect? Yes. Do they talk to each other?
Okay, was that to me? I was just thinking with the Geoscience Data Journal, it tends to be a simultaneous or in a very short space of time. The publication of the data set was happening at a similar time to the data paper, slightly ahead. And we were, sometimes we were aware of both, sometimes we weren't, but in any case, if we didn't know about there having been a review of the data set, then we tasked the reviewers with that. I think what came out of one of the peer review workshops was the fact that, as in standard peer review, you might send a paper to two different specialties. To perhaps in say geosciences, it might be to one geologist and one modeller who would look at things differently, who would pick up different issues, and then you might have to send it to a third person for an overview or for some other capability or specialism in order to be able to synthesize the entire response. I think that with primary research papers, the data set could well have been uploaded some considerable time before, so there would never have been any connected review process. And I think in the future, you might well get people who realise that they've forgotten to put the data set in the right place, and they've already published the primary research paper, and it might happen time around.
I mean, in the community that I work with, that's still the majority of the cases, that the data is in the paper, in the data table or supplement that we haven't seen at all. And I sometimes have a slide in my presentations about the quality of the data review as part of the article review, because all that metadata is not there, it's poorly documented and so on. And when we start to integrate that data into our syntheses, we have to constantly contact the authors and say, what was this, what happened here? So when I hear concerns of the community saying, well, do you have unpublished data in your synthesis? That's bad. I show that slide and say, the current peer review of those papers doesn't really do the data any good. Not all, there are a few exceptions, but...
One thing a bit related to this, and we're talking a lot about burden on reviewers, which is true, it's a significant issue, people spend a lot of time. There's also burden on authors. There's a situation where you have, there's a clear repository, your data fit into it very easily, that's fine, but there are other fields where it's really not the case, and you have to jump through an enormous number of hoops to be able to deposit it.
Yeah.
And that's something that we think about too, and it's an issue when you're thinking about whether you're going to mandate versus stick versus carrot, as you were bringing up. It's an important thing. Authors already jump through a lot of hoops to publish their papers, and we want to add to that.
I'm afraid we're going to have to make that a topic for next year's SSP, because we are out of time today. I'd like to thank you all for coming and contributing to the lively discussion, and thanks once again to our speakers.